Sunday was the first day of fall, and while it may not come this week, cooler, wetter weather will eventually hit the Northwest. What can livestock owners do to make sure their cattle, their horses, are ready for the fall and even early winter weather? That's a question I recently put before Washington State veterinarian Dr. Amber Itle.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things we should be thinking about when we're winterizing our farms. And really what we're wanting to think about is how do we make sure our animals are happy and healthy this winter? And what do we need to do to ensure their safety? And really what I like to think about is in terms of the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. There's kind of been this kind of outline from the World Organization of Animal Health to help us better understand what do animals really need to make sure that they have good welfare. So just those 5 main categories to start us off are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom and the ability to express normal or natural behaviors, and the freedom from fear and distress. So when I think about those 5 categories, there's several things that come to mind when I think about winterizing my farm for livestock. I think, first of all, even before we get into the 5 freedoms, it's just really thinking about natural disasters. So what do we need to prepare for? So first of all, right now, we're dealing with fires, we're dealing with smoke, we're dealing with the potential of floods coming. So it's crazy because right now we're like, oh, it's hot, it's dry, there's drought. So we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about recovery from fires. But we also, as we come to winter, have to start thinking about what does it look like for floods and the risk of flooding. So, and thinking about mud management, which was a huge concern last year. So those are some things we want to think about. So we'll start out with, hunger and thirst. I want to be thinking about what's my feed inventory look like for the winter? Do I have enough hay for the number of animals I have? What's the quality of that hay? So I had my hay tested or my forage is tested. And am I going to be feeding grain? Do I need to have minerals or protein supplements to make up for any deficiencies based on those results? That's really, really important, especially if we have pregnant animals that we're trying to overwinter. To make sure we have a successful calving season, for example, we need to make sure that those animals' needs are being met, not just to maintain their own growth, but to be able to grow that baby in there so we have a really healthy and robust calf on the ground. So those are some things we want to think about. Also, when we think about hunger and thirst, we think about pasture management, because really it's ideal if we can give our pastures a rest in the wintertime, but that's going to require us to bring animals off those pastures. Not everybody has the ability to do that, but we do need to think about the fact that the pasture doesn't have that same nutritional value that it does in the summer. And so we can't rely on pasture for a good nutritional source for livestock and horses as well. So really thinking about what does our feed strategy for the winter look like? As far as water goes, water is always important. This is a chance for us to look at our waters, make sure we have enough of them for the number of animals we have so there's not a lot of competition, make sure they're clean, and make sure as well that maybe we have the ability to heat those water systems, make sure our heaters are ready to go so that our water doesn't freeze as the temperatures start to drop. So those are, I think, the most important things when we think about feed and water and nutrition. Probably the most important thing we need to think about coming into winter to be prepared. I would think maybe to add on to that is just thinking about discomfort. How do we keep our animals comfortable in the winter? One of the things I noticed last year is we had a huge problem with mud management, especially in eastern Washington. There's a lot of farms that maybe don't have shelter in a traditional sense. Maybe they don't have a barn. Maybe they don't have a slab for animals to get up on. But it's really important that we think about how we get animals a dry place to stand. So what does that look like? Do we need to bring in some hog fuel? What do we need to do to kind of build up some mounds so they can get out of the mud? Because mud management is something we can think about now. We also think about repurposing a building, a slab, a commodity bin to allow animals to come in out of the weather? Or can we create wind blocks by, putting up big round bales somewhere? But we need to be able to provide some wind blocks or a space for cattle to get out of the weather, because we know that wind is really hard on animals. It really makes it more difficult for them to maintain their body temperature. And then that also expends more energy. So we're going to have to feed them more. If we don't give them enough shelter or an ability to get out of that wind, they're going to require more energy and calories to be able to sustain themselves in those kind of conditions. So those are things we can also be thinking about. Also, if we're having calves or babies, as this is, January, February this winter, we want to make sure we have good bedding, something dry, something warm for those mama cows and those calves to kind of nest in so that they can stay warm. It's really important that we provide some dry bedding or some space for them to get out of the weather. We know we can have some really long winters, even in Western Washington, where it just rains and rains and rains, and mud is an issue constantly. One thing I wanted to bring up on, a lot of people like to put blankets on horses in particular. I think that's great. We can help provide some, shelter or some protection from the weather, but we have to remember to take those blankets off at least every month and check out the body condition score of that animal. Because so often what happens in the winter is we put that blanket on and we're like, oh, we're going to keep my horse nice and warm and dry. But then the horse is getting very skinny and we have no way of monitoring that. And so it's really important to get those blankets off, take a look, make sure everything's looking good, make sure they're keeping condition on, and making sure we don't have to change our strategy as far as their diet goes. So that kind of covers the kind of comfort piece. The next piece I think is really important to think about is managing pain, injury, and disease. And we do that through our veterinarians. We really need to have that veterinary client-patient relationship, have that veterinarian come out this fall when they're checking over your animals. Make sure your animals are up to date on their vaccinations. Get some fecal exams run, understand what your parasite load looks like. So coming off of the summer pasture, we may have a significant parasite load. And you don't want to feed those parasites all winter long. So the best thing you can do is work with your vet to figure out, okay, I have a parasite load. This is what it looks like. This is the appropriate type of deworming mechanism I need to use, or the best strategy I can use. So one of the things I like to do or think about is when we deworm animals is we want to get all that larva out of there. We want to get all those worms out of there after we deworm. So we want to be able to contain them, deworm them, clean that area out before we release them so that they don't reinfect the environment that they came from. So really be thinking about parasite management coming into winter, and perhaps even doing some fecal exams throughout the winter to see how we're doing with that. So either, stomach worms or intestinal worms or coccidia. There's a lot of different kind of parasites that we want to be able to figure out. That'll help us understand the right treatment for those. The other thing we want to think about with regards to preventing injury is making sure our fences are fixed, making sure that everything's looking good right now so that going into winter, animals aren't getting tangled up, or there's not down barbed wire somewhere, or we have those kind of very preventable fixes that we can address now. And also thinking about footing. So as things get wet or icy or muddy, animals are going to have more trouble navigating a pasture area or even a slab. So thinking about what can we do to make sure that footing is sound so they don't slip. Especially around feeding areas where animals are congregating, those areas tend to get really wet, slippery, and difficult to navigate. So really be having a plan ahead of time, like how am I going to move my hay rack around the pasture, or how do I get them on a slab so I can clean that and provide safe footing for those animals to be able to move around. The next thing would be, how do we allow those animals to continue to express normal or natural behavior? So we want to think about things like competition around feed bunk spaces or competition around hay racks. Do we have enough hay racks or enough feed bunk space for all of the animals in our herd to feed at the same time? I mean, cattle in particular, they're herd animals. They want to feed and they want to eat together and they want to lay down and they want to sleep together. So it's really important that we don't create an environment of competition around feeding and watering spaces. So just count those number of animals, make sure you get enough space for everybody at the bunk or at the watering area so that we don't have a lot of competition there, and we're not creating a lot of stress for those animals without even realizing it. So avoiding overcrowding is important, and also thinking about mixing species together. So a lot of people like to mix, I'm going to put my horses and my cattle and my sheep and my goats and my dog and everything else all in the same pen. So just considerations about stress that they may or may not impose in those situations, because certainly that can create some awkward situations for animals, especially animals that, are prey animals that are afraid of predators. And that kind of brings us up on this fear and distress welfare component, which is really thinking about how do we protect our animals from predators. So thinking about that now coming into winter, predators are hungry. I don't know, whatever's out there that might be looking for an easy snack. We want to make sure that we have those preventative measures in place and those mitigations and control to try to keep wildlife out of our pens and to try to keep predators away so that our animals aren't living in a fearful and stressful environment. We also want to just really think about adopting low-stress handling and management components So in our day-to-day work, when we're moving animals, we're handling animals, especially in the winter, and they're in more confined spaces, to make sure we're doing that in a calm, collected, and stress-free way. So that kind of covers the 5 areas of animal welfare that's defined by WOA to better help give us some guidance for what to think about as we're thinking about overwintering animals. There's certainly lots of other things we could cover today, but I think that kind of gives us some of the key strategies we need to think about with regards to prioritizing our readiness for this fall and winter.
And Dr. Itle, as I was listening to you talk about that and going through all of those points, a ton of great information. It seems like, and I know a lot of livestock owners already do this, but we have to realize that our horses, our cattle, our goats, whatever the case might be, for some of us, they might be pets, but for the rest of us, they're in an investment. So if we're going to get some sort of ROI, we have to treat them well now. That way they can go through the spring, summer, and onto the fair and make us the most money possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important that we're really considering those kinds of things, because I think often what we forget about is if we don't feed an animal quite right, like let's say, we get her pregnant this year and she has the baby, but we didn't quite feed her right through the winter and she got a little thin or she had a little bit of an extra parasite burden, what we find is those animals are slower to recover, slower to come back into heat, slower to get bred back. So they may not get pregnant the next year. And then that's a total loss of the investment you've made. So at least for cattle, it takes you, till you can get them bred and you can get your first calf. They're, already about 2 years old. And so you hate to only get one calving out of that animal or one lactation out of that animal. So it's really important that we're making sure we're paying attention to that. And that goes across species. Any animal that either lambs in the spring or kids in the spring or calves in the spring. It's the same concept. We need to make sure they're not getting too skinny, but also that they're not getting too fat, right? That we're really trying to monitor that and get it just right. But you're right. The investments we put into these animals in the winter certainly reflects in outcomes in the spring and the summer, whether they're fair animals or whether we're using them for production animals or for food. We want those animals to be as healthy as they can be, so that they're in the best possible shape they can be to do their job.
Once again, Washington State veterinarian Dr. Amber Itle.